All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm so glad that you're here joining us for today's discussion on making our online and in-person event spaces truly accessible. My name is Kelly DeLong, and to start with a visual description for those who may need it, I am a white woman with dark hair wearing a dark sweater, using a background with the MADVoters logo. I'm here tonight representing MADVoters, an Indiana nonpartisan organization. At MADVoters, we believe that democracy only works when it's accessible to everyone. We encourage a commitment from every Hoosier to make intentional efforts in creating inclusive spaces, both online and in our communities. This conversation is personal for me. I'm not just here as an organizer, I'm here as a student, as a parent to a middle schooler who relies on an AAC device. I see firsthand the challenges of navigating a world that isn't always built with everyone in mind. But it's conversations like these and having such incredible advocates to turn to that truly make the difference. So before we dive in, we're going to ensure that this space is working as best as it can for everyone. It is being recorded. We ask that you keep your mic muted and your camera off for the best accessibility. Our ASL interpreters, Alicia and Rachel, are pinned. If you have any trouble seeing or hearing anything, please let us know. We will have time for Q&A at the end. Please use the raise your hand feature when the time comes. I am honored to introduce our presenters tonight, two people who are at the forefront of advocacy in Indiana and didn't hesitate to be here with us tonight. First, we have Jalen Resminski-Hooks, the Executive and Lead Policy Director of Count Us In. Jalen's work in policy and community organizing is vital to ensuring marginalized voices are heard. And we're also joined by Jeffrey Bignell, the Director of Advocacy with the Indiana Association of the Deaf. Jeffrey is a tireless leader in breaking down barriers to communicate and access across our state. Jalen and Jeffrey, welcome to you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And as people trickle in, I can go ahead and share the slideshow Jeffrey and I made together. And before we start talking, I'll make sure too that make sure accessibility is working okay before we get started into our presentation. Can everyone see both the PowerPoint and the interpreters okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Awesome. Well, Jeffrey, we can go ahead and get started. So Jeffrey and I have been working really hard and just really grateful for MADVoters for hosting us in this space, just for more accessible organizing and campaigns. So we'll go through really an accessibility 101 for you all to have toolkits and resources, as well as just the state of what's going on for both deaf, hard of hearing, and cross disability communities right now in Indiana. A little bit about Count Us In. Count Us In, we were founded in 2020 in Indiana, and we're the first Black disability incarceration impacted led nonpartisan nonprofit that's advocating for more equitable and inclusive political participation and larger voter turnout, as well as more diverse voter turnout. And we seek to educate, empower, and show the community that our voices matter. I founded Count Us In as a person with lived experience with disabilities. So just a quick image description of me. I'm a Black Japanese person with long, dark brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a white sweater that says Count Us In. And I founded Count Us In really to build cross-disability movements that center BIPOC communities, especially Black communities, because oftentimes we're left out of civic engagement. And just from my own experiences navigating mental health, and non-visible physical disabilities. And through Countersin, we are advocating to decarcerate, decolonize, and bring disability justice to democracy. So this is just a list of the programs we have, but happy to share more during the Q&A. And I'll pass it over to Jeffrey to talk about IAD.
Hello, everyone. I am Jeffrey Bignell, and I will go and explain a little bit about my visual description. I'm a white man with clear colored frames, glasses, and I have blue eyes. I have a little bit of a dirty blonde hair and a ponytail, with a black shirt, black colored shirt with the IAD logo, the Indiana Association for the Deaf logo. IAD, so I'm going to explain a little bit about what we are here for. We are a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization, and we are also a nonpartisan organization. We promote access to preserve, protect, and advance civil, human, and American Sign Language and linguistic rights for deaf Hoosiers. We are dedicated to really advancing access to education, employment, and social justice, and also safeguarding the legal rights for the deaf community. We empower individuals through advocacy, education, and community support. And we are also affiliated with the National Association for the Deaf, or NAD. And anytime I mention the word deaf, just for your awareness, that would include anyone involved in the community, maybe them deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind, deaf and disabled, hearing loss, and whatnot. So I want to go ahead and explain some of my personal experience. So political candidate, there was a campaign kickoff around my home, and there was a poster and a flyer or poster on Facebook, and they were encouraging everyone to go out to the kickoff event. And I had saw that there was no accommodation requests. There's no way for me to get an accommodation. So I was thinking, okay, how can I reach out for an interpreter? And there was no way for me. So I went ahead and showed up anyway. And so I show up to this event, and honestly, no interpreter whatsoever, no captions. So I was a little bit at a loss. Also, I did use my phone, of course, to do speech to text and communicate the best possible that way. And obviously, it was not accurate. Did I still have full access? No. And when the audience wanted to ask questions, of course, my phone can't pick up their questions from across the room. And so I was a little stuck. And I felt like I wasn't getting a lot of information as everyone else was. And I felt there's a lot of different implications with that. If one person, becomes a legislator and the legislator makes a policy decision for us in the deaf community, where is our access? Where is our engagement with that? Does that mean that the deaf community and our feedback, are they aware of our accessibility issues? Are they aware of our concerns? I mean, no. And so, for example, one policy, the Indiana University policy in Indianapolis, they have an interpreting training program or an ITP, and they just decided to shut that down due to a lack of students in the class. The students weren't meeting the minimum requirements for the class, and so they closed down the program. And at this point, we were thinking, oh, so we're going to lose interpreter access? That's a huge pipeline for interpreters in their careers. Additionally, with the ISD budget, the deaf school here in Indianapolis, the budget was cut. And so that impacts our access to education. That impacts our access to a full school that provides language access. If we have to mainstream into a hearing school, how will that work? Will we have an interpreter there or not? There's just a lot of implications and a lot of trickle down. And so that means that we voters are also left out, of course. Where's our community? And so obviously, this is an ongoing fight to get access to be able to receive a ballot. But another barrier for us is the information. So that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Jeffrey. And this is Jalen. And just to kind of share more about why accessibility matters, I was just going to add just some of my lived experience in navigating inaccessibility and organizing protest, and even I used to be a chief of staff in the political space, as well as just something that I've witnessed as someone who really strongly believes in cross disability solidarity for my peers with other disabilities and deaf communities. So really from my lived experience, just as someone, I have compartment syndrome in both of my legs. So a lot of people who look at me, in addition to not having, you know, maybe the most visible disability, with mental health disabilities, with compartment syndrome, I experience a lot of excruciating pain when I have to stand or walk for extended periods of time. So in protest settings, I often had to exert myself when I first started getting into the organizing space, because a lot of times people expect, oh, you're not really an activist if you're not marching with us. You're not really an activist if you're not walking this mile with us in solidarity with this issue. And I used to try to do it, and I would find myself in bed for days, dealing with chronic pain because compartment syndrome, it makes my muscles push against my nerves in my legs. And I learned that's not sustainable for me. And so I always speak out so that people can understand that, activism can look in so many different ways. Or going to events, sometimes I would go to events that are a little bit more of like maybe a campaign meeting, and it would all be standing tables, nowhere to sit. And I would find myself having to leave after 30 minutes just because even though I want to talk to people there, I just don't have the ability to stand for excessive amounts of time without having a break to sit. So I just say that to illustrate, whether you're a grassroots activist, or if you're, a campaign worker or someone who's really just trying to go out to meet people that are also having community discussions about issues. Sometimes people you don't expect may need accessibility. Never assume. I think accessibility should be the default. In having a younger face, I'm often asked to do more labor of lifting and carrying things upstairs. But I think it's also just important for people to ask when mobilizing and setting up spaces as well, what people feel comfortable doing. And just from a cross disability note, when I first founded Counteson, we were going to the Fort Wayne City Council budget hearing downtown. And when we were there, just during the time when George Floyd freshly happened, and we were all very concerned about where our budgeting was going towards in our community. And it was this beautiful moment at first where you never saw so many Black, disabled, and other grassroots advocates in a city council meeting in Fort Wayne before in such a long time. But unfortunately, because there was no captions during the meeting, and of course no ASL, there were some people who were learning ASL trying to sign for some individuals, but they did not offer it. They didn't want to put it on the TV. So I watched some peers leave in tears, not able to sit with us because they literally could not get audio from or literally not get any captions or ASLs to be able to follow the meeting. And the internet in there was very poor, so we couldn't generate any either. So that's just an example that just from a cross disability sense, accessibility truly matters for access to information. It truly matters for us to be able to even participate and join movements. And it really matters so that we feel like we can belong in civic engagement, and just be able to access what we need to know to get activated in these spaces. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Jeffrey, to this point.
I think we can continue. Thank you.
Awesome. And just a snapshot as a whole, approximately 1 out of 4 people in Indiana lives with a disability, and just to kind of note too that this is often underreported, and this, encompasses, mental health, physical, and other communities in the cross disability space as well, just to show that Indiana is very similar to and mirrors the United States proportion of folks with disabilities.
Yes, and this is Jeffrey. In Indiana, we have about uh, 542,842 deaf and hard of hearing people. And we also have information from the US Census as well back in 2020 that documented that there's no specific number exactly of deaf and hard of hearing people, but we did want to mention that there is other data recently in 2024 of American community surveys that they collected that do have a hearing difficulty selection. So not sure exactly what their parameters were for that, but I think they collected about 2.9%. So that's about half of this 542,000 number. Just to get us, some comparison, we definitely need better data. We need more involvement in the community to affect the political voting happening here. If you know what's going on in your community, you're better able to make decisions based on who's running for office. But how can they represent us appropriately is one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now.
Absolutely. And just kind of to the point of fair representation and people who are leaders in our community, elected officials, and just the legislative landscape, I had a few examples of here of past advocacy efforts to make spaces more accessible. And also that ties back to some of the examples I shared earlier. Um, During the pandemic, when Counteson was first founded, we found that there was a crisis of, people being able to access how are these decisions being made in public meetings, especially when there is a lot of fear of the ongoing, people getting sick, in addition to other accessibility needs. So during the pandemic, House Bill 1437, it was a big push from a lot of us in the disability community, like Counteson, independent living councils, and many other incredible groups and grassroots organizers came together to modify Indiana's open door law during the pandemic so that people could be able to virtually listen in and participate in public meetings, and tried to expand it where if it was a body that was mostly composed of folks with disabilities, to allow us to be able to participate remotely as well. Um, Now that we're in 2026 and the world no longer has us in a state of emergency, even though COVID does still exist, there are still risks to immunocompromised people, and that's a whole other thing. Governing bodies do have the ability to adopt their own policies for being able to participate in public meetings. And unfortunately, similar to a lot of trends of people no longer being able to work from home and being forced to go back to work after the incredible accessibility that was provided from these type of moments in the pandemic, a lot of groups and a lot of bodies have now backtracked to business as usual and having to go in person for everything, when there's a lot of other accessibility considerations as well that existed prior to the pandemic and still exist today. Um, and just a note on closed captioning, that same year, a lot of us mobilized to make it a public accommodation for any TVs to have captions while in public. But unfortunately, that effort was killed by a business lobby in the state, and it ended up being blocked where wasn't able to move forward to require captioning in public spaces. But there were good things that happened since then. So I'll pass it to Jeffrey at the local level. Some things that have worked out a bit better since then.
Yes, in relation to the captioning, the statewide bill did fail, yes. However, um, they announced in Bloomington, one of the small towns, they passed a uh, captions for the public area for all the TVs. However, the Fisher's Law didn't pass, but it's also more set as a policy concept, and it's working really well. There's a lot of people, deaf people, who live over there, and so I know those two have kind of been more encouraged to have captions. However, I suspect the reason why that bill failed was because there was already a standard like operating rule for TVs in restaurants. For example, Buffalo Wild Wings. That restaurant is required to have license to uh, permit the sound on. However, if the sound is off, the captions must be on. So I think they were also concerned about, you know, are captions going to be like a loophole to kind of cause the TV sound to be turned off? And so I think that's one of the reasons as to why it failed.
Definitely. And yeah, that's it's exciting to hear like when things do work out at the local level, and it just kind of shows similar to how it's important to focus on the state and what we can do here locally. Even just focusing in on the local county or city level is really important. Um just for additional context too, um kind of going back on the theme of we're not only going back to business as usual, we're advocating the best we can in our disability communities, but we are living in tough times where we're going to have to continue to fight at all levels for change. So the ongoing issues that we're experiencing in this current climate, as many people here already know, we're experiencing a lot of Medicaid funding cuts while healthcare costs are rising. And for Medicaid and other different support programs that keep our community able to live in the community instead of in institutional and other healthcare settings that are more restrictive. There's work requirements added as well. And in addition to just the rise in costs to healthcare and the cuts to Medicaid, there's a lot of cuts to local agencies that really protect the rights of our disability community. So Indiana Disability Rights has had to advocate for itself for a while now, of making sure that they're able to have funding to be able to support Hoosiers across the state that are experiencing inaccessibility as our local protection advocacy legal advocate. And at the federal level, cuts to HHS or Health and Human Services, the substance abuse and mental health service agencies, community living, and so many other agencies that really not only operate at the federal level, but are key investments for states like Indiana that would help recovery centers, help people who are navigating mental health disabilities, helping people who are in physical therapy, being able to stay integrated in the communities and have the resources they need to thrive. When a lot of those things are consolidated and budgets are cuts, it impacts elders, disabled folks, and caretaking families to the point where those type of resources, whether services or financial, could really pose a risk to the amount of resources we can get to be able to stay in community, and puts us at higher risk of being segregated and institutionalized. In addition to just that background in social safety net programs that are being impacted at the state and federal level, currently some disability groups are gathering for a call to action regarding the Texas v. Kennedy's case that popped up this year. I believe it was February. This is like a zombie case that keeps seeming to come back in different ways. But currently, there's a federal case where 9 states with attorney generals, including Indiana, are attacking Section 504 of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires all federally funded, government funded entities to have ADA accessibility. And it is also attacking past Supreme Court precedent, Olmstead versus LC, where Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson, the two plaintiffs, actually set the legal precedent of ending segregation of folks with disabilities by requiring people to use alternative community care instead of being straight pushed into institutions. That is also being attacked. So a lot of people are organizing now to really protect those precedents so that community members can continue to thrive with community-based services. And so the default isn't institutionalizing us and keeping us away from our families, our neighbors, and our communities. And there's also other great cases that illustrate the moment we're in as well. And Jeffrey, I know you had a couple you wanted to share this landscape.
Yes. So the Hallmark versus the town. So there hasn't been a resolution yet. It's still in proceedings right now, but I wanted to kind of fix that statement. But the Hallmark is a deaf man who was already in the office using one of the campaign Facebook pages for government information, like COVID relate COVID related information. However, they were trying to send that out for people to understand what was going on. However, no one had provided access. There were no captions, there was no interpreter or anything. And so he kept asking for any sort of accessibility accommodation, and they kept refusing that. And Facebook page isn't required to provide captions. Hallmark used that for the government information to help, because this is still considered under the ADA. And so the court actually overrid that, and then they went ahead and continued to the federal level to try and overturn the state decision. And after that, it was sent back to the local.
It hasn't been fully
Local,
resolved though.
go ahead.
And so at this point, we're just encouraging people to vote, of course, but that's not covered. The ADA isn't covered in that. And so they are using, if they use a government, it's kind of a gray area, if you will. If they're using a government facility, it's covered under the ADA, but really it's more of a reflection on if a political candidate wants to make sure that their campaign and ads are accessible, that shows they care. If they refuse, that means they don't care, if you will. And so that's where there's a little bit of hesitation there. And then also Prekel versus the state of Indiana. This happened way back when in 2015. It's already been resolved. And in this instance, so Prekel was a deaf man, and his mother was put into court for a case that had happened. And Prakel, as a deaf person, wanted to just support their mother. That's it. They wanted to just watch. They didn't have any relevance to the case. They were not a witness or anything. They just wanted to watch the case or the trial. And so they requested an interpreter, and they were immediately told no. They were declined the interpreter because of them not being involved relative to the case. And so they filed a complaint with the court, and it was federally recognized as a violation of the ADA. Because anyone else who happens to be, passing by and wants to watch the case, they have automatic access, but deaf individuals do not. And so, as a way to promote equity, of course, the city lost that case. And so, from here on out, we're trying to make sure that courts are aware of providing access and providing interpreters, no matter who is involved or not involved, whether it be a witness, an attendee, what have you. And so that's kind of what I'm here to say.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And yeah, I feel like the slide is called legislative landscape, but we wanted to just share some legal instances and precedents as well. And just as a law school graduate, I can attest the law isn't always ethical and moral, which is why it's really important for us as advocates to really like understand what's going on and what's pending and push for what's right in both representation as well as legislation. And I think the point Jeffrey is highlighting too about deaf communities being able to see, even just being able to sit in and watch what's happening in courts, is also very important, since currently in our legal framework, ignorance of the law is not an excuse. So it's really important for all of us to be informed what the current laws are and policies for accessibility to information, and also just for community awareness and safety. And I'll pass it back to you, Jeffrey, about just an overview. So we set the landscape, and now we're gonna get into a little accessibility 101, just so you all have some tools of how you can make your spaces and organizing and campaigns more accessible.
Yes, I just want to make sure that you have a picture of the description of what this shows. For example, like, I was describing my logo. I'd have to say, what color it is. There's a yellow border around it of the Indiana Association for the Deaf, and in the middle is in big capital letters is IAD, and then underneath it says 1986. And so, just kind of making sure that we have a specific visual description of what the picture looks like. As well as whenever you have videos, make sure you have captions put on them. That's the standard practice now. When you're planning any sort of events like a kickoff or a campaign or a political, someone coming through or making a pit stop in your area, make sure that you have accessibility accommodations at the ready. That means maybe schedule interpreters beforehand. One of the best suggestions I can say is make sure you schedule interpreters beforehand, because it takes a long time for them to prep. The interpreters need to know the context and everything like that, instead of, the interpreter just showing up and not really understanding what this is about, what's going on, or anything like that, where they should stand, all of those types of things you want to avoid. So it's better to give yourself ample time to prepare for where the interpreter should be, what they need to know, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, you can also budget in the cost as well for that. Oh, and just to add to that, at IAD, we have some events that are deaf blind. We have deaf blind attendees, and we'd like to make sure that we set a space for them, not just for deaf and blind, but anybody in a wheelchair, maybe some people who have their own if they don't want to be close to anybody, just there are so many different accommodations that you want to be aware of. If there are deaf blind attendees, then make sure that they have, space for themselves, plus the SSP or someone who is, going to be with them. Also make sure that you provide a pro-tactile interpreter for communication access. And that also requires planning as well. Oftentimes, it's best if you have the event planner and then you have a secondary planner, hopefully a deaf person or someone who identifies with a disability, and those people can really communicate with each other and make sure that every aspect of the event is coordinated and planned for.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And yeah, we're going to jump in just so you all have examples of this stuff. And the only thing I'll add is just, I can't emphasize what Jeffrey said enough. Budget, budget, budget for us. it could be heartbreaking if you have people who want to come and literally can't access your event. So it's important to make sure you have things set aside so interpreters can be there before as well as after the event, right? Like just because the clock strikes 8 o'clock, it doesn't mean, and let's say there's a networking event, that doesn't necessarily mean people are going to go home right away. They might want to network and hang out with people after. So really just making sure there's spaciousness for people to fully feel included and being able to participate. And I'll just add like being flexible and open-minded. So I gave examples of, non-visible disabilities. So of course, making sure the space is accessible for like wheelchairs, access to seating, but also just asking the question, do you need accommodations, right? Like there's no cookie cutter framework that's going to fit every disability. So making the space open for people who have different needs is very important. For example, like I have severe anxiety, so I tend to prefer to sit near the aisle or at the end of the aisle or towards the door. So there's certain things too where it could be a very easy thing to do that can help someone feel more included and be able to participate. Um, and one example, like we said in the overview slide, is just making sure there's image descriptions and alternative text. And some people are like, oh, I need both. Yes, please do both. So when it comes to informing people about events, like posting on social media, writing your newsletters, even generating your PDF version of your flyer, these are very important things to have. So alt text is a very short, brief written description that gives content of what's being displayed. And that's usually on the back end of your posts. And it's really essential, especially like if someone is scrolling and the page isn't properly loading the entire image, it's really helpful for screen readers. And then there's image descriptions. So when you go on Countess in social media, you probably see like, oh, what is this image description thing? If you're questioning that, that's what we're doing. We're really giving a more longer visual description of the context of what the flyer says. And that's usually displayed under. So like if it's a newsletter, you'll see it right under the image, or if it's social media, you'll see it in the caption. And that's really to help people with vision disabilities who use software that maybe they have a different type of screen reader or use text to voice or need to enlarge the text. So using both is a great way to being able to capture more community needs as a default universal accessibility in the digital sense, rather than starting from nothing. And like I said, why both? It's really important because these things exist in different locations for people to be able to know what the image is conveying, especially if that information is not in your caption. And yeah, like I said, like best practices, like make sure you have both, and make it a standard practice for your social media plan and outreach to have it there and in your newsletters and any other documents and platforms that you're using for folks who need screen readers. And also, obviously, it's an image description and alt text, so don't put emojis in it. That's the worst thing you can do, and it can be very confusing. And then Jeffrey, I think you had a point you wanted to add too about image descriptions and deaf-blind individuals.
Yeah, I did. So of course, alternative text or alt text are usually already set up for blind users so they can have that visual description, but deaf-blind users do not have access to that, of course, and so they typically rely on an image description down below in the caption. So that's typically why we ask for both. They're very crucial for to have both included, specifically for deaf-blind individuals who might not have access to the alt text. They can depend on the visual description, which could have a range, depending on their range of vision. But that will let them have access to the visual description or the photo description. And so I have seen often too, other posts when I'm scrolling, where a blind member will say, please give me the visual description because, and then other people will say, we already have it. You have the alt text. No, that's not, that's not adequate. And so we need to be mindful of that to be ready to provide yes, of course, it's twice the work, but that's important because we here at IAD, we do a lot of that type of work. We do a lot more additional work for our posts because when we post a signing or a signed vlog or a signed video, we have to put in the caption, the transcript ourselves. Oftentimes people who are speaking using English or spoken language, they have alternate or auto captions, but we have to actually design it ourselves to make sure it's visually friendly. And so it's kind of twice the work, of course, but we want to make sure that standard is set where everyone, and make sure everyone has access. Oh, also, yes, one more thing I did want to add, emojis. Of course, we do encourage not to use those. Often, sometimes they do work for some deafblind individuals. If you show the emoji, it'll say, I with a smile, and you could add kind of like that visual description, smiley face. Just have a description of the emoji if you are going to use an emoji. Of course, that is going to add to your text, but it's very beneficial for the deafblind community.
Definitely. And yeah, I have some examples from other platforms. The other thing I'll add too is like kind of like how when we introduced ourselves as people during this webinar, right? Like we're describing ourselves, and it's nice to sometimes even describe the space that you're in. I remember I went to the White House for a Black Disability Convening during Black History Month. Obviously, this was years ago, but it was the first time they had a blind individual there. And I realized no one was telling this guy like what was in the room, what the art looked like, what the doors looked like. So we were just chit-chatting next to each other, and I was giving him image descriptions of even the space he was occupying, so he could really also enjoy that experience that's surrounding us. And I just throw it out there too, like this doesn't just have to be limited in a digital space. When you're doing events, image descriptions of yourself that can help people find peers in their cultural community, as well as just being able to enjoy the ambiance of whatever that you set up, so they can enjoy that too with you. um and these are just screenshots of places where you can add alt text and image descriptions. So Twitter, whatever they call it now, if you still use that, I don't exactly, but in case you do, there's a space where you can click add description and add alt text in addition to putting it in the caption of whatever photo you use. Generally, I don't recommend doing heavy photos in Twitter. Most people um, are looking for more quick updates, but if you do and run out of text space, people will kind of put them in like one of two image description, two of four. If you're running out of space to just do a full image description, that's what some people do in the caption portion, in addition to adding the alt text behind the photo. um, Facebook, just kind of showing quickly here. When you click edit your photo, you can hit change alt text. I always recommend, I never use the default that Instagram or Meta automatically comes up with, just because they're not good. So like if you can see this gray box here, um, it's okay, but I actually had to go back and fix that myself, just because, for instance, some of the formatting, like there's some words made up here, didn't read properly. That would be really frustrating. They're like, what is narn parma? Like that's what something could be read. So I always say like go in manually, fix and change the alt text. And that's how you do that in the back end of Facebook. You just click edit image and then you hit change alt text, and you can just type it right on it under there. And then Instagram, similarly, when you're posting a photo, you'll hit more options. You'll scroll to the very bottom here and it'll say write alt text, and that's where you can plug it in. So this one's like an example. I was playing around with the flyer for this event before I posted it on Count of Sins page. And then of course you put the image description in the caption. And if your caption's too long, then you would pin it in the comments. But ideally, in addition to this alt text, you would put it in the caption itself as well. But yeah, that's the quick on image description and alt text, and I'll pass it to Jeffrey for captions on videos and during live meetings.
Yeah. Um, So for captioning purposes, it's really important to make sure that anything regarding a post on Facebook, YouTube, whatever it may be, making sure that the captions are accurate and fluid, making sure that the words are cohesive, spelling is accurate. If there's any errors, sometimes that happens, those are need to be fixed. Making sure there's a preview or review before it's posted, because sometimes if there's an error, people can say, oh, that's good enough, but there could be misinformation being sent out. For example, the bottom example on the slide here, they said we will protect voting rights. But the auto caption changed it. It seemed like the person was speaking too fast, or maybe there was background noise or something interfered with the captioning, and it changed to we'll protect voting riots. And so if a deaf person was watching this and depending on the caption, they would think, oh, we protect voting riots. Is that actually what they meant? And so then the hearing people heard it and said, oh, okay, the rights. And they heard what was actually being construed. And so there's just two different messages getting across there. So it's really essential to make sure accurate captions are provided. Um, sometimes there will be an accidental replacement of a word. So you have to be really careful and mindful of that. Um, Of course, also you want to make sure that the layout or the visual of the caption is very simple with a black background. Either white or yellow letters is typically standard. Yellow is typically more common because deafblind individuals typically read yellow better. And often we try to make sure everything is accessible in that area. Um, a very simple, plain font, very simple style, nothing too crazy or outlandish. Some movies, they will have some words, that pop up, or some type of like videos will have special effect captions with their music video, which honestly, that's not deafblind friendly. Deafblind individuals would struggle to read that. And so making sure things are plain. And of course, making sure the size is decent, not too small, because some people prefer really small captions, but they should be at an average size. Also, again, auto captions can sometimes work, but you always need to make sure that you review those. But again, if you rather type your own manually, that's fine too. Um, any type of in-person meeting, if you want to add captions or a PowerPoint presentation, go ahead and find a captioner. It's important to use a CART captioner, which means that it's a conversation access real-time translator, and they are professional who specializes in real-time captions. They can provide access on Zoom, any type of in-person or digital platform. That's always recommended. One thing I do want to emphasize too is any Facebook, TikTok, any type of social media using or a live stream. Anytime, typically those happen on social media. They often don't have captions. YouTube as well, any live streams on YouTube don't have captions. And so technically we are often left out of those live streams. If there's some new information or current events happening, we are kind of in the dark about that. And so making sure that we're aware of that as well. And so now we're going to discuss a little bit about ASL interpreting. Of course, you see we have interpreters here on the meeting. And really the purpose of ASL interpreters is to provide direct communication access to information and effective communication. They're not just an add-on, if you will. They are necessary requirement for communication access to make sure we can all understand what's going on. And also, maybe you've heard about, things going on in the White House about the White House removing their press conference interpreters. As interpreters maybe being an interruption or distraction, we see that excuse ongoing frequently. And, the speaker feels like, oh, I don't want people to look at the interpreter instead of me, which is really complete misinformation. The interpreter is part of the presentation, if you will, to provide that message to those who need it and facilitate. The interpreter is not a disruption or a nuisance to the meeting. And also, planning ahead of time, of course, that will have the best chance of a successful outcome. And I just wanted to mention as well, it's very important. In Indiana here, we have a very huge interpreter shortage. And so um, it is not easy to request interpreters. It's very important to request them in advance rather than last minute, a day or two ahead, and then we're scrambling to look for access. It's better to do that way in advance so that we have a better chance of finding access for an interpreter. And of course, teaming for interpreters is very important as well. You'll notice we have two interpreters here today. They take turns every 15, 20 minutes as needed, depending on their teaming preference. Um, and oftentimes they don't work over 20 minutes because that can be fatiguing for especially for an event like this, a longer event, because oftentimes you're processing two different languages at once and facilitating those, and going between two languages easily can be draining. So oftentimes the standard is up to 20 minutes. If you are interpreting for over 20 minutes, your brain processing time and your accuracy does decline immediately after about 20 minutes. There is one link under ICRID, which is the Indiana chapter for the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. And there is a list of agencies on that website so you can contact. It's not an end all be all. There's just a few agencies. Indiana doesn't have a perfect centralized location for all agencies in Indiana that host interpreters. And so you can look there for some resources. Also, as we mentioned before, DHHS, Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services, has their list of interpreting agencies as well. But of course, it's not all inclusive. And so, again, for tonight in this event, the interpreters we used, the agency that we used them from are not on either list. So, again, you have to kind of get creative to find interpreters, and of course, it can be tough. And having interpreters, again, I just wanted to make a comment. Interpreters have to have the right lighting. Their schedule has to be aligned with the schedule that needs to be set. For example, if there's one meeting, often meetings will let them have an open comment time one or two times. If the meeting continues over 2 hours, it seems like, maybe, for example, if there's an agenda that's going beyond the 2 hours that the interpreter was scheduled for, um, and that open comment time might have to be removed. For example, if the interpreter is only scheduled 2 hours and the time is up, then we might not be able to have that open comment time. And so it's important to have a flexibility when you're scheduling an interpreter to make sure that they're scheduled for ample time to allow any overages. And also regarding interpreters, I always recommend having making sure you're asking the deaf person their opinion about the interpreters, because often interpreters are sort of about asking the deaf person and conversing with them to make sure that they're comfortable. Me personally, I like to make sure I'm closer to the presenter, and often the presenter will be fine and allow me to sit closer to the front or near the presenter. But it's important for me to have that engagement to make sure that everyone feels comfortable within the space and there's a plan. Additionally, if there's a presenter who plans to have an interpreter, make sure they're aware. It's just important for everyone to be aware that there will be an interpreter present. Um, so there's communication, there's not anyone left out of the loop. Um, it just helps ease of communication. Also, some thoughts about diversity. So, deafness is not a one-all be-all. It's not an ASL for everyone, and that's that. Some people are oral and they may be deaf. Some people use cute speech. That's a very small number of those of us, but most people use ASL, speech, oral, and there's so many different methods of communication. ASL is one, but of course we have variances. We have PSE, which is Pigeon Signed English. We have Signed Exact English or C, which are not officially a language that we recognize, but that's their, method of communication. That's their preferred mode of communication. And so it's important to make sure interpreters are aware of those differences in communication so they can best prepare. For example, there was one situation with one deaf woman recently who um, had requested an interpreter use a different colored shirt. Because oftentimes a white interpreter will typically use a black shirt, contrasting colors from their skin. But in this situation, this woman, the black was too jarring for her visual preferences. So she needed a white interpreter using a white shirt. And so they had requested that, and they had to make sure the interpreters could accommodate that. But when it comes to event planning, you have to make sure to ask the interpreter to make sure they have or ask the client if they have specific preferences. So that can be relayed to the agency. The event coordinator can make sure that's facilitated and that the provider or interpreter would know ahead of time. That way, everything is very smooth and solidified. Also for deaf individuals or deaf-blind individuals, they often require pro-tactile interpreters in some instances, which is very different from a standard ASL interpreter. It is actually a person who's very hands-on and is actually touching the client using pro-tactile hand under hand communication. And we could go in depth about that, but the point is that that's one way they communicate through touch. We do have um, ASL to Spanish interpreters, trilingual interpreters as well. Oftentimes, those happen, we're seeing those at a deaf school where there's a hearing audience or there's, Spanish speaking people in the audience who don't know English. They will bring an interpreter who knows Spanish who can do ASL to Spanish. And also, some deaf individuals prefer having a deaf interpreter brought on. Um, A deaf interpreter is more there for support of clarification, facilitation, and making sure conversations go smoothly. If there's any type of really gritty content, and maybe the deaf individual doesn't understand the hearing interpreter, like the ones we have here. Sometimes deaf individuals don't understand the hearing interpreters due to nuances and language differences. So they might ask for a CDI, a certified deaf interpreter. And so the hearing interpreter facilitate the spoken language, and the CDI would be able to really nuance that into ASL for the client to make sure the message is understood clearer. And again, planning ahead is always important. Ask for specific details, ask for the client's perspective. And also, again, well, captioning. Again, captions are really beneficial for everyone, not just for us who depend on captions in the deaf community, but really for all. They're very an inclusive thing for neurodivergent people, as well as, of course, hearing people do really appreciate captions as well. So we should make that a normalized practice for all because it really access benefits all.
And yeah, on this slide, these are just some examples that Jeffrey and I put together of resources for captioning. Obviously, if you're doing a live event, or even if you can do this too, like after an event, if you want a video, like after recording for something, you want something accurately captioned, you can hire someone. But if you are, an organization that has more limited budget, making sure you put in time to really correct those captions like Jeffrey was talking about earlier. And then I put some additional apps like Mixed Caption, Veed, where you can act, depending on how long the video is, and how many short videos you're doing, it can give you free credits so that you could be able to capture some of your social media caption some of your social media content. Social media platforms do have captions as well, but similar to what Jeffrey was saying, you still need to go back to correct it, and they don't always transfer properly. Like you can have great captions on Instagram, and then if it cross posts on Facebook, they're not there, and that just becomes a whole thing. So, what I like to typically do is make sure it's embedded in the actual video itself, and making sure there's time accounted for that. Um, is there anything else you want to add more about caption resources, Jeffrey?
Yes. So, for example, YouTube and Instagram, they do have auto captions. However, they allow you to edit it before you post. Also, I just want to emphasize this reminder. It's really important when you use Instagram for your reels, make sure that you are separating the Facebook and Instagram posts. Because, for example, when you have captions for Instagram and you post your reel and then you just auto connect it to Facebook, the captions will not show. And so making sure that you are looking at both how both look when you post each is a good idea. In previous experiences, I've asked a lot of people to add captions and they said, well, just turn on auto captions, turn on your phone settings. And I'm like, oh, I did, but it's not really accurate. But, and also like, who are you to tell the deaf community what to do? And so I think it's more of just an understanding and, really taking the time to look at your videos. A lot of people overlook, the Meta app, especially in terms of Facebook and Instagram. A lot of people overlook the fact that they don't correlate with each other. They're very different. So just be careful when you're posting Instagram reels and then you're cross connecting it to Facebook. Make sure that those captions show up in Facebook as well.
Yeah, and it's also just good practice, right? Like you want things spelled correctly. What if someone wants to look a person up later, an org up later? It's just also respectful. Like my full name, Jalen Radziminski. Every time I say my name, there is like even if you do the subtitles in the Zoom, it's spelling my name wrong. So it's just very important to be just like very careful as you edit to make sure people's name is spelled correctly and organizations and other important information is properly conveyed in your captioning. I'll move through this pretty quickly just so we have time for Q&A.
Yes,
Oh,
and
go ahead.
I did want to add one more thing, Jan. I just thought of this relating to captions. I know some of you are wondering what's the difference between an interpreter and the captions. Why must we have both? And it's best practice to get both because ASL and English are very different languages. Many deaf people grew up experiencing some language deprivation, which means they don't really understand a lot of English. They rely on ASL more. And so we do have some people in the deaf community who can utilize both English and ASL. But the best practice is to, combat that issue and just get an ASL interpreter and rely on the captions as well.
Absolutely great point, Jeffrey. Other quick tidbits. So including that there can be accessibility, that ASL interpreters can be available, are really important in just when you're creating flyers and just making sure there's a contact info, like contact person if someone has accommodation requests. When you do flyers or PowerPoints or written materials, really like making sure the text is at the very least size 14 or larger. I tend to skew towards 16 and some people think that's better too. Obviously, some people will still need to zoom in more, but it's a good practice to just make sure you have large, clear text and making sure it's an accessible font like Arial, Calibri, Open Sans. I know a lot of people really want some cutesy, cool designs, but what is a flyer if not everyone can access it and know what it says? So just using accessible fonts so there's contrast between capital letters and word and letters of words. Making sure when you have links to text, and even just within your design itself, making sure there's a good strong color contrast between your text in the background, making clear what is a link versus not a link. Underlining alone isn't enough. So these are just tidbits that we wanted to share just so that you can have a sense of, making sure, people may be colorblind, and if there's not enough contrast between some elements of your flyers or information that you hand out, it could make it really hard to read. And yeah, design elements as well. Like, so everybody loves a really cool looking flyer, but just making sure too it's not challenging to read the words itself on the flyer, because sometimes when there's a lot of things going on, it can make it harder to distinguish what words are on there. And just keeping it in plain, easy to understand language. And I know, Jeffrey, you had a note about deafblind tech as well in processing flyers and pamphlets.
Yes. A lot of deafblind people use a device where it can connect to a screen or a computer screen, and the screen, they have a screen reader. However, it is also attached to another device that is also similar to a braille machine, where they can feel what the screen reader is seeing. And so that is really just making sure that the accommodation not only can match to the screen reader and make sure it's accurate instead of, missing some information. For example, like you were saying with the links, when, the pictures move, that's really cool flyer and everything, but the screen reader is not going to be able to read that, and it's not going to be able to capture that and make sure that that's being accessed to those deafblind individuals. Also, you were talking about the font. Government, online sources usually cap it at 14. And so just making sure, the similarities are universal would be great. And a lot of, the plain text, instead of, like you were saying, those fancy English style words, or plain language, I guess, also is one of the things that I really wanted to just mention here.
Yeah, and finally, just a quick reminder again about accessible spaces. I know I gave an example in the beginning, but really just encouraging everyone here. ADA compliance is literally the floor, not the ceiling. So yes, it is important to like be privy on what buildings are ADA accessible. That's great, but when you're creating space for community, when you're bringing people together, thinking beyond that and just the diverse needs of different disabilities and different communities so that we can really be included. So just considering, is there places to sit and rest? Considering, if it's a march or protest, are there alternative ways for neurodiverse people or people with physical disabilities to be able to participate? Are there, interpreters available to be able to really like sign and for people to understand what the chants are? We all want to be able to fully participate in this experience. And Countess, and I know we've played a big role in a lot of big important moments like rallies during redistricting and a lot of other important movement events, ensuring and conferences, ensuring that we remind our peers that there are ASL interpreters to be able to access those information and participate in just a simple protest space, considering neurodiverse folks. So some events like how we did in Juneteenth a few years ago, what we did is we have color coding for some of our name tags at events. So like I'm neurospicy. I'm like, so there's like green, we often do like green, yellow, or red. I'm like a yellow where I like hugs for people I know, but if I don't know you, I really don't like to be touched. So that like sometimes we have colored tags on stickers for people who are more sensitive to being touched or more sensitive to people you don't know being close to you, versus some people may be greens and they're fine being close to anybody. And then there's some people who might be a red and they really do not want you in their bubble. So there's just different ways to consider neurospicy people like myself too when you're organizing things, and just also considering, some people have like immunocompromised conditions or high risk of getting sick. So considering testing and encouraging people not to come if they're ill. We do that in a lot of our hosted events as well that we lead. And just overall, just be a kind person, like making sure that the space is considered of service animals. I don't think everybody knows, but I actually have a service dog when I have my flare-ups, and you and there's so many instances where it can make something more anxiety inducing if people are very hostile towards that. It takes a lot of training and effort for people to have a service animal. So just being open minded to that and not always assuming the worst in people. And just, having obviously accessible parking, drop-off locations, or like I mentioned earlier, just being able to easily access those buildings is also important, or at least making clear if there's an accessibility entrance when you're putting greeters at events, making sure it's very obvious for folks who need an accessible entrance to get in as well. With that, we'll wrap it up. I know we started a little late, but just for me, you can contact me at jalenr@countessindiana.org. That's our website, Countess Indiana. And I put a little flyer here. This is actually led by IU and Hoosier Asian American Power. Of course, I represent Countess In, but I'm also a member of Hoosier Asian American Power, or HAP, and really an incredible Asian disability icon. Alice Wong passed away. She was actually born in Indiana and was honored by our legislators this year. So there's an honoring of her life. And if you all want to learn more about disability justice and how an incredible woman like her really changed the country, the world, and her visions for accessibility, strongly encourage folks to come to IU campus at Cook Center on March 25th to learn more and continue your accessibility journey while also honoring the life of an incredible person.
Likewise, if you need to contact me, my email is advocacy@iadhoosiers.org. But if you're also curious and you want to learn more about the agency that I'm associated with, please go ahead and click on that. Also follow us on Instagram and Facebook. You can see, what posts or the events that we're doing within the community. Sometimes they're, advocacy related. We just have various events. Also, we're celebrating 140 years this year. And yeah, yes, it's exciting.
Well, thank you. And yeah, Jeffrey and I will pass it back to Kelly if we do have time for Q&A or for the closer.
Wow, that was incredible. I think I took a couple pages of notes. Um, I really do appreciate both of you sharing so much, just being able to reflect on um, being able to watch a school board meeting in my local area and knowing as a hearing person how difficult it was to know what's going on. Like I can only imagine the frustration. Um, and even like pointing out the captions, like sometimes we laugh because it's funny to us, like the little bloopers that we can see across the screen, but we're getting that in multiple contexts. So to think that somebody is relying on that information, how important that really is just so crucial for us to know and to think about when we're in those spaces. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, if you want to raise your hand, we'll see if we can sneak in a couple. No, I think we're good. I don't know. There's a lot of really good information. Um, and of course, they have your contact information if they want to follow up with any questions and things like that. And I think we should do something like this again because I know there's so much to talk about in this space and so much better that we can be doing as a community to be more inclusive. Um, so I guess first, thank you on the behalf of MADVoters for both of you doing this tonight. Thank you to our interpreters tonight who did an amazing job. Um, I do want to have a couple of calls to action. So April 6th is the deadline to register to vote for the May primaries, which is fast approaching. Make sure that your registration is current. You can do that at indianavoters.com. And then commit to one change, whether it's adding the alt text and descriptive to your social media post or ensuring that your next in-person meeting is welcoming for all, really working on those small gaps to bridge that gap. As we move forward to the 2026 elections, do our part to make sure that no Hoosier is left outside of this conversations. Keep an eye on your email for the recording and a list of resources as well. And I know Jeffrey has been incredible about helping educate me through this process, being patient with me, and is working on getting us some more resources to share out with the community as well. So thank you everyone for your time and your commitment to an inclusive Indiana. Have a good night.
Thank you all.